My husband and I are both from a suburb, Ferndale, and our white parents did move to the suburb, and we both graduated in 1953. And I think a couple things that you say I want to question. First of all, World War II needed workers, and it didn't make any difference whether they were white or black. They needed workers, so many people went north, regardless. And there's a new book that both of us have just read talking about the reviewing or the revitalizing of Detroit. But the main 2 years they're talking about there is 1962 and 1963, when Detroit was rolling so high that they even went to the Olympics, trying to get the Olympics in Detroit. So, I mean, all these ideas of falling apart, it is true. There are 800 acres of land in the heart of Detroit that is now vacant. And so, I mean, it's part of it. But when you don't take into consideration other things like the war, I didn't hear you really emphasize the war very much. Mm-hmm. We lived through all of that. We're Depression babies.
Thank you for the question. And although I didn't talk about the war very much in our interview, it's actually a very important part of the book. And so I think you're right to point to that significance of it. During the war, Flint grew dramatically as white and black and Latino workers from all across the country descended on Flint to both to find newer and better jobs, but also to seek more freedom and protections from some of the civil rights violations they'd experienced in the South in particular. And so you're right to point out that the war was instrumental in driving Flint's emergence as a real industrial powerhouse, not just Flint, but also Detroit. They were referred to, as you know, as arsenals of democracy, the places that helped the U.S. win the war. But the fact of the matter is that on the ground, even though there were many opportunities for workers of color to obtain newer, better industrial jobs in places such as Flint, they were also not in many ways the lands of opportunities that many black migrants had thought they might be or hoped they might be. And as I try to show in the book, Flint was a profoundly segregated city even at this point in time. Even as the U.S. is fighting fascism abroad, at home we see public policies in housing, public policies in education, public policies in urban development and other areas maintaining a very rigid color line. Even within GM plants during the 1940s and 50s, there were separate entrances in many facilities for white and black workers. Many black workers found it impossible to secure jobs other than as paint chippers, car washers, or janitors. And so even though the war opened up a lot of new possibilities for economic advancement, and those are important to highlight, it also highlighted many of the existing inequities of places like Flint. So I think it's a complicated answer, neither black nor white there, but I appreciate your pointing that out.
Hi.
Hello.
I had a question. So I appreciated your comment about like a possibility for new opportunities in Flint, but to what extent is there a sense that there's worse yet to come given that lead has long-term negative effects?
Right. I think that's up for debate about where we go from here. Certainly, as in previous crises in the city, a number of people have predicted that Flint will no longer cease to exist in the form that we've known it. There's likely to be a massive out-migration over the next few years. And of course, you can't blame anyone for wanting to leave a city where the water is potentially poisonous. And also, I mean, I think frustration now has really mounted in the city because after all of this attention, after all of the coverage during the Michigan primary and the debate in Flint and the MSNBC showing up, only about 35 lead lines have been replaced there. And the federal government has stalled an appropriation to help speed those efforts. And so here we are, many months down the line, only a few dozen lines replaced. And that's very discouraging to me, and I think probably to those who are living there. Another issue that I think is likely to surface and present more difficulties is that the demand among local homeowners and residents and the mayor, Karen Weaver, for replacement of all lead water lines is in conflict with the city's recently enacted master plan, which advocates shrinking the city and having people relocate from sparsely populated neighborhoods into more densely packed urban core neighborhoods. And so we're likely to see conflicts over that emerging as people who wish to stay in their sparsely populated neighborhoods demand new infrastructure, even if that's in violation of the existing master plan. So that's another conflict that I think is brewing. But one thing and so I think you're right to say that Flint's darkest days may still be ahead. One of the things that I've been most cheered by, for lack of a better word, in recent months, is just the persistence of ordinary city dwellers to fighting for a better future for the city. And this is something that Flint residents are very used to, right? After all of the economic calamities, each one that comes, people say, that's it. This is the one that's going to be the knockout blow for Flint. But what I found in writing the book, and I'm finding now, is that people persevere, and they fight for their city. They don't turn their backs on it easily. And so people are there organizing now, and the fight continues.
Reminds me of the mayor of Detroit, the then mayor of Detroit a few years ago, essentially was run out of town after proposing that large sections of Detroit be abandoned and return back to nature and turn off the lights rather than and try to concentrate the population. Didn't work out politically well for him, so we'll see what happens in Flint.
Two things I didn't hear you talk about, or at least not directly. One is the long-term policy between real estate and the banks to redline. I'm very familiar with that, having come from Buffalo. Yeah. That was a problem in Flint, I'm sure. Fortunately, government policy has now changed to make it more difficult to redline, but it still happens. Mm-hmm. The other issue that concerns me is that industry goes where it's cheapest, which is why we've seen the flight out of northern cities into southern rural areas. Can you see any policy that could change that so that we would have a more stable industrial situation that would prevent large businesses and industries from just going where it's cheapest?
Mm-hmm. Those are great questions, and you're right, it wasn't one of the focal points of the interview, but redlining, federal redlining plays an essential role in my book. And what I discovered about Flint is that, as in Buffalo and many other urban centers, federal housing officials actively redline neighborhoods of color, but also many working class white neighborhoods as well, arguing that they were unfit for federally backed mortgages. And that made it virtually impossible in Flint for African Americans to obtain new home loans, and they were virtually excluded from participating in the suburban housing boom of the post-World War II period. And that really contributed to starkly uneven patterns of development in the Flint metropolitan area that have persisted in many ways. We hear a lot about the rise of suburban diversification over the past generation, and Flint suburbs have become somewhat more integrated over those years, but still to this day, even though the city has a majority black population of around 56% or so, the suburbs are still 90% white. And this is, years after the ostensible end of redlining with the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And so the legacy of those programs has lasted far beyond their use in practice. And so absolutely, that's a vital part of Flint's story. In terms of your question about industry, I think that this is a tricky conversation, because in this particular political climate, the idea of any kinds of restraints on capital investment seems to be probably off the table in many circles in this type of election season. But one of the things that I noticed in thinking about Flint's trajectory is that the deindustrialization of the city has created something of a race to the bottom within these struggling urban centers. And so Flint, this formerly well-to-do, high-wage industrial center, as it's lost all of these factories and high-paying jobs, has marketed itself as the new sort of South, a place where you can set up a business, a place where you're going to get a streamlined set of regulations governing your enterprise, a place where trade unions are willing to bargain with you. And so Flint's trying to market itself as the new Mississippi, as a place where you can do the kind of business that you could formerly only do in the Sun Belt. And so, but that's created a real race to the bottom, well, with the UAW conceding virtually all of its control, within local plants. But this has also created some new investment in the city, and so it's a complicated issue. It's not easily answered.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk this afternoon. I have one kind of historical question and then kind of a present question with the water crisis. I found it interesting that you mentioned in the talk that GM kind of wanted to work within the local suburban structure and didn't necessarily want to go straight to the Sun Belt. If you could talk more about those conversations with homeowners. I know that homeowners associations are very popular, especially after the restrictive covenants were ruled unconstitutional. So if you could talk about kind of their conversations a little more. And then also, in terms of fixing the lead and the water pipes and everything, a lot of us know that you use like tax revenue and things like that, and even sometimes like housing revenues to get the money to do these public works type things. If Flint is struggling so much with jobs and with low income areas and things like that, what are some ways that they could address their problems?
Those are really, really insightful questions. So to go back to the first part about the dialogue, the political discourse regarding regional government and annexation between Flint or between GM and suburbanites. So on the one hand, you have GM with this aggressive metropolitan investment strategy, right? Building plants in the suburbs, but then trying to return those to the city. On the other hand, though, you have a coalition of what I call in the book suburban capitalists who wanted to not only invest in the suburbs, but then see those suburbs secede from the central city. And so they reacted in disgust at the notion of Flint annexing these suburban plants. They wanted to hoard those tax resources. They saw them as funneling millions of dollars into their local tax base, into their schools in particular. And they refused to share those sorts of resources. And so they benefited materially from the political fragmentation of the metropolis. But this was something that GM saw as being detrimental to establishing a corporate-friendly sort of government of scale in the metropolitan area. And so the dialogue was, on the one hand, white suburban homeowners arguing that they had invested in their suburb, and how dare anyone come in and made that suburb appealing to industry, and how dare anyone try to take that from them. And often what I found interesting about the organizing of these suburbanites during the 1950s was that they often framed it in terms of their children. How dare you return this plant to Flint and take money away from my child's education? And so schools are front and center in this discourse on metropolitan government and fragmentation. But on the other hand, then, GM executives are saying, if we don't get our way on this, if we can't establish a metropolitan government, then we're not going to see Flint as an appealing place to do business. And they meant it. And over time, as they lose their grip on local politics, as they lose their plan to establish regional government, as their corporate-backed city commission and council representatives lose their control over local government, GM starts to rethink its Genesee County-oriented strategy. And so, and that ultimately leads to this wave of deindustrialization later. Now, in terms of your second question, am I remembering you correctly saying that it's about how to pay for?
Because if it's
right.
Deindustrializing an impoverished area, how do you get a tax base to implement things like fixing
Right.
the lead pipes?
Right, a tax base that has not hit bottom. We're just starting, the spring and summer real estate sales season, and we're likely to see a lot more people fleeing the city. And so, Flint hasn't hit bottom and is absolutely going to require massive investment from the state of Michigan and the federal government to begin to repair the pipes. And so it's impossible for the city of Flint to do it on its own, in particular because there's also now a wave of lawsuits that are ultimately going to be probably crippling to the city's ability to support basic infrastructure and services. And so we haven't seen the end of this yet, the bottom, so to speak. But it's already clear that the state, and of course the state bears so much of the responsibility for the crisis in the first place, that they ought to be first in terms of helping to bail out the city and replace those lines.
Well, thank you so much for a great talk. I was curious if you could maybe say a little bit more about the origins of the emergency management system and what that says about the politics of metropolitan America today, because it's am I correct in saying that all the cities that did have emergency managers appointed in Michigan were majority black cities?
I believe so, yeah.
And what does this kind of say about the sort of limits of urban power and the sort of ability of cities to perhaps go on paths that diverge from some of the sort of political trends that you've noted here, and kind of how that might say about sort of what solutions might be on the table for Flint and other cities where you see a stark sort of divide between the sort of political parties and ideologies of urban populations versus, in this case, the state of Michigan.
Right. Excellent question. Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out that in Michigan, under this emergency management system, over half of the state's African American population is now under emergency management. That accounts for Detroit, of course, and its public school system, the city of Flint and Benton Harbor, a number of others struggling, either majority black or near majority black cities. And so it's been an absolute affront to local democracy. But and I think up until now, there have been a lot of critiques of that as being a usurpation of our ostensibly revered traditions of local democracy. But now we've moved into a whole nother sphere of danger here, because beyond simply violating our basic tenets of democracy, this emergency financial manager system has also cast aside local expertise. And when it comes to understanding infrastructure and the chemistry of water, local expertise really matters. And so by assigning these teams of budget-oriented, public affairs and MBA types, they've really put the emphasis on the bottom line, on cost cutting, and they've sidelined local experts from the utilities departments and others that could have easily prevented this sort of crisis. Apparently, among water chemists, it's basic knowledge that when you have a corrosive water supply, you add phosphates. They're cheap to add. They don't cost a lot. Lots of cities use them. And yet somehow in this rush to cut the budget and balance the books, they missed that. And so what I'm getting at is that there's this broader, beyond simply the violation of our democratic traditions in a way that's explicitly racialized and discriminatory. It's also simply dangerous and deadly, as in the Flint case.
Hi, Andrew. Great talk, Birch. Wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you.
It's the case, I think, of too many historians in the room, because I was going to ask the same thing as Andrew Carl. So I'll go to my backup question. Having written about deindustrialization in Philadelphia, I'm struck by what's the same and what's different in these two cases. One thing that's the same is the regionalism story, that regionalism fails, and I think, maybe everywhere, maybe a key departure point. What's maybe different in the two cases is the underlying economic base. In Philadelphia, much more diverse manufacturing base at the start of this period. Right. So my question is, how much of Flint's outcome is driven by, as in the case I think of Detroit too, that heavy reliance on essentially one sector of the automobile industry?
A great deal of it. But in Flint's case, not simply one economic sector, one corporation. In Flint, GM is the only game in town. And when GM pulls out, the city has very little else to build upon. In recent years, city officials have tried to recruit a newer and more diverse array of businesses, to some with a modicum of success. And yet, as you're right to point out, because of that very heavy reliance on one corporation, it's made the recovery that much more difficult. There's another way in which Flint is similar to Philadelphia. I don't have time to get into it now, I think, but maybe we can talk later about this, because I actually felt like, as you did, that with urban renewal in the 1960s, there were possibilities in Flint for a more equitable outcome, sort of like what you document with Philadelphia, but maybe we can talk about that more privately.
Thank you very much. It was really enlightening.
Thank you.